So today's topic is Shankara's place in the world. Now, Shankara is the short name, short form of Shankaracharya. Those who are familiar with India's philosophical tradition should keep in mind that whenever we speak, whenever we use the word Shankaracharya or Shankara, we mean only the great Adi Shankaracharya, who was born in the year 778 AD and passed away in 810. He lived only for 32 years. Because you come across many Shankaracharyas. These are all different offices, like the Pope is like a papal office like that. So when we use the word Shankara, that term specially refers to the original Shankaracharya. It's called Adi Shankaracharya, means the original Shankaracharya. He established 4 important mutts in 4 different corners of India: the extreme south, west, north, and east. And he installed 4 of his disciples as the pontiffs, the abbots of these 4 monasteries. And they also assumed the name Shankaracharya. But they are only the followers of the great spiritual philosophical doctrine, the spiritual tradition of the great Shankaracharya, who lived between 778 and 810 AD. Now there is something very interesting about this great, unique historical figure. The Buddha, Shankara, and Vivekananda. These 3 are the great spiritual and philosophical revivalists in India's spiritual tradition. When we mention Swami Vivekananda, we actually mean the 3 great spiritual personalities who came together: Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, his disciple Swami Vivekananda, and Holy Mother. These 3 great spiritual personalities are included in this group. So these 3 great spiritual advents in India's history played a very important role, not only in India's spiritual tradition, but also in the religious history of the world. Shankara, as I said, was born in the year 778. Now, and Buddha was born in 560 BC, and Swami Vivekananda in 1863. So altogether, you can see a wide canvas of time from Buddha to Swami Vivekananda, almost 19 centuries, 1900 years. At one point, the Buddha stands, on the other point, Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna. Now, when Buddha was born, you find, if you look at the Greek Western philosophical tradition, there were 2 great thinkers who were almost contemporaries of Buddha. One was Pythagoras, the elder contemporary. The other one was Heraclitus. Both these 2 great Western thinkers were contemporaries of Buddha, who lived far away in the Greek cultural philosophical tradition. And Swami Vivekananda was born in 1863. When Swamiji was born, the intellectual climate of the world was in many ways similar to the times in which both Shankara and Buddha had their advent. When Buddha was born, India was passing through a very crucial, critical period in its philosophical and spiritual history. The old Vedic religion had come to be misinterpreted as lifeless, mechanical ritualism. Sacrifices in the name of God, often sacrifices involving animal sacrifices. You find there are many similarities between the Mimamsaka ritualistic tradition, which was prevalent in India when Buddha was born, and the Jewish ecclesiastical priestly tradition that was prevalent in Judah and Palestine when Jesus was born. Religion had come to be interpreted as blind ritualism, and Buddha put a stop to this. So it is often said that Buddha was born to put a stop to blind ritualism, which involved the sacrifices of animals. So famous verse is the Dushta yeknya vikhataya pasukimsa nivrittaye baudharupam dadho yosu tasmai devaya te namah. This is the famous verse referring to Buddha's advent. Buddha was born to put a stop to the superstitious rituals involving animal sacrifices. And when Swami Vivekananda was born, religion and spirituality were facing serious challenges. The new discoveries and developments in modern science and technology, the discovery of sea routes, the emergence of a new middle class, mostly consisting of traders and businessmen and industrialists, the new developments in society during the post-industrial revolution age, then the emergence of Marx and Engels, who questioned religion as a whole as something anti-humanistic, as something which completely neglects the realities of life in this world, and again new developments in Western philosophical tradition, mostly the positivist tendencies, which questioned religion, spirituality, transcendental values as a whole. So religion and spirituality were under siege. God has incurred a bad name, so also religion. That was the time when Swami Vivekananda came to the West and gave a new interpretation to religion and spirituality as a whole. And what was the interpretation? It was the interpretation of Advaita, non-dualistic philosophy, which Shankaracharya gave shape to in the 8th century. So today we are talking about universal religion, practical Vedanta. See, if you go through Swami Vivekananda's complete works, you find he speaks of a religion which is essentially the manifestation of divinity already in man, which is in a way the harmony of all the spiritual ideas enshrined in all holy books, still going beyond the conventional organized religious dogmas. A religion which teaches you to look upon the whole mankind as one spiritual family. A religion which gives a place to non-believers also as much as believers. A religion which doesn't ask you to believe blindly, which gives you freedom to put questions and to disbelieve if you are not willing to believe, if you are not willing to accept. That universal religion which Vivekananda preached in the Western world was the non-dualistic philosophy of Shankaracharya. It was this great spiritual leader who actually brought out the non-dualistic system of philosophy out of the Vedic literature. I can give many examples. If you read any of the Upanishadic texts, and if you don't read the translations, if you go by the word, if you try to understand it literally, you'll be surprised, you'll be alarmed, you'll be shocked. They don't contain much they don't contain much spirituality or metaphysics. It was Shankaracharya who actually built up a philosophical edifice on the Upanishadic literature. This is something which many who are not specialists in Vedic hermeneutics or students of Vedic philosophy do not often appreciate. Today when we read Chandogya Upanishad, you can get translations in English. These translations are based on Shankaracharya's commentary. It was Shankaracharya who gave a philosophical meaning to Vedic statements. Now, there is a dialogue between, just give one example. There is a dialogue between a great saint and sage of ancient times, Sanat Kumara, and a great rishi, a sage, Narada, in the Chandogya Upanishad. I won't quote the mantras. Now, this sage, one of them, Narada, puts a question. I heard you have acquired a wisdom which enables human beings to transcend sorrows, pains, and miseries in this world. Please teach me that wisdom. Tarati Shokam Atmavid. The one who realizes, the one who understands the true nature of Atman, our own true essence. He or she transcends sorrow, pain, and grief. That's the goal of all human beings. That's the goal of human existence. Now, the teacher asked the student, both are sages and saints, asked the student, what all have you learned? Please tell me. So the student gives a long list of different branches of learning which he had mastered. Then the teacher says, Nama Eva, all these are words. See, what do you mean by that? All the branches of learning, chemistry, mathematics, physics, everything. Bible, Gita, Quran, Vedas, everything. Unless you realize the inner essence of these spiritual literature, what are they? They are only words, names. See, the same alphabet can be used to coin the word God and also many other words which may have undesirable meanings and implications. Now, what are they? They are nothing but different combinations and different formations of the same letters which constitute the alphabet. And behind these words, behind these letters, behind these sacred writings, there is something else which goes deeper than the words, which is a matter of inner intuitive experience. And that is the central theme of this chapter in the Chandogya Upanishad. Now, it was Shankaracharya's commentary which brings out this meaning. Otherwise, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. Tattvamasi, you are that. What do you understand by that? I am Brahman, you are that. Well, these statements don't mean anything unless you understand these statements in the light of Shankaracharya's commentary. It was Shankara who put a philosophical meaning into Vedic statements. Remember, see, Vedic mantras are not written in the same Sanskrit language which we study today. Entirely different. In fact, the language of Rigveda is totally different. Remember, they're all vernaculars. The language of Rigveda must have taken its present form almost 3,500 years before Christ. Maybe earlier. That by MacDonald, Keith, and many other Western Orientalists who have tried to study this. They are surprised at the distinction, the difference between modern Sanskrit and Vedic Sanskrit. Now, these Upanishad mantras, which we study, Katha Upanishad, whatever Upanishads, based on which Swami Vivekananda built up his universal religion, are written in such an archaic Sanskrit language, with which without Shankaracharya's commentary would not mean anything to any of us. It was he who put a philosophy, a spiritual doctrine into these Vedic mantras. Before Shankaracharya, many of the Vedic mantras were interpreted by a few pre-Shankarite writers, like Yaska, who wrote the famous book is called Niruktam. It is a kind of almost like a dictionary. But he has not attempted much. He just gives the meaning of a word. See, for example, Devo. Well, what is Deva? Devo Danadva, Dyodanava, Deepanava, Dyusthanava, Bhavati. I'm just quoting to give an example. Yaska says the word God, God, is small letter, plural. It means somebody who gives you knowledge, somebody who gives you illumination, somebody who lives on the higher celestial region, Dusthanova, somebody who listens to your prayer. That's all. This is the meaning, nothing more. But when these words were interpreted by Shankaracharya, they got a new spiritual life. They started teaching mankind a new universal spiritual philosophy. That was the magic which Shankara worked with the Upanishads. And he wrote commentaries on the 10 fundamental Upanishads. In fact, all that we know, that we teach, that we preach, that we read today as Vedanta emerged out of this Upanishadic literature. And this Vedanta philosophy was built upon it, the whole Vedic literature, Upanishadic literature, by Shankaracharya. And that's not the only work he did. Today we are reading Bhagavad Gita. We chant Bhagavad Gita. If you ask any Hindu, what is your book? Christians have a Bible. The Muslims have got a Quran. What is your book? Hindu would say, well, there are many, but one small book, Bhagavad Gita, the central book, which contains everything. You know, this Bhagavad Gita, we would not have read today if Shankaracharya had not written a commentary on this book. Bhagavad Gita has got only 700 verses. And it is taken from a vast body of literature, Mahabharata, which has more than 100,000 verses. So Bhagavad Gita is just a tiny particle of Mahabharata. And this Mahabharata contains many songs. Bhagavad Gita means a song sung by the Lord. That's what it is. Now, Mahabharata contains several such hymns like Bhagavad Gita. Some of them are even more marvelous than Bhagavad Gita that we are reading today. This book came to be known to mankind because Shankaracharya wrote a commentary on this. That is the work he did. And that's the earliest and most sublime commentary available today. And then, so that's, you can see the importance. Today we are preaching, teaching, reading Vedanta. It is practically his creation. We have to remember, Vedanta did not originate with Shankaracharya, but the Vedantic philosophical spiritual edifice is his creation. Bhagavad Gita did not originate with him. It is in the Mahabharata. But Bhagavad Gita, the classical world spiritual work, as it is known today, became so well known, and it became a classical spiritual work because of Shankaracharya's commentary. Otherwise, Gita, if Shankaracharya had not written this Bhagavad Gita, this would not be known to anybody, because there are other Gitas, other poetical works which are more sublime than Bhagavad Gita. And then another important work he did was, it's a bit technical. There is a book called Brahma Sutra, which is purely logical. It contains nearly 554 pithy statements. Some of the statements are very small, one or two words. Some of them just a phrase. Some of them just one word. Now, these words, this is a marvelous book. Now, what Shankaracharya did, He wrote a big commentary on these 554 pithy statements. If you print all this together, it may not run into more than a few pages. But Shankaracharya's commentary is so big. In fact, that is the most marvelous work in the Vedantic tradition. Now, this is the only thing. You will be surprised to know Adi Shankaracharya, the greatest Advaitic teacher, is also the greatest devotional poet of India. The most marvelous, the most sublime, the most beautiful Sanskrit devotional poetry was written by the greatest philosopher of India. I have compared Kant and Shankara because very often Shankara is compared to Kant as a philosopher. If you take Kant as a philosopher, is compared to Aquinas, you call Aquinas as a theologian, because Shankaracharya was also theologian and also philosopher. Is compared to Augustine because some of the fundamental doctrines on Indian philosophy, not only Vedanta, were coined and formulated by Shankaracharya, just as Augustine synthesized the old Neoplatonist philosophy, though he gave it up, but still he took many things from that, and he formulated the fundamental theological dogmas of modern Christianity, like the original sin, the total helplessness of man, the concept of surrender, the city of God, we find. Now, very often, Shankara is compared to Augustine and Aquinas as a theologian and to Kant as a philosopher. Because Shankara's most marvelous philosophical work, Brahmasutra Bhashya, is often compared to Critique of Pure Reason. How Kant deals with the British humanism and some of the earlier systems while trying to establish the central doctrine of German idealistic philosophy. Shankara also did the same while writing his commentary on the Brahmasutra Bhashya, trying to refute the views of the earlier non-Advaitic, dualistic, pluralistic, and pantheistic and materialistic philosophical systems of ancient India. But Kant was a mathematician. He was a great moralist, and he appreciated the importance of science. But he was not a poet. And secondly, I'm coming back to Shankara. You'll be surprised to know what all work he did. Apart from writing these unique philosophical theses on the Upanishads, the Gitas and Brahmasutras, and writing the most sublime devotional poetry in Sanskrit language, he wrote innumerable introductory works, which is called Prakarana Granthas, primers, introductory works to Vedanta philosophy. And then what he did, he didn't sit alone. He traveled all over India 4 times. Today, if you travel from extreme south to extreme north, Badrinath is near Chinese border. From Sri Lanka's border to Chinese border, if you travel by plane, again you have to travel at least 200-300 kilometers, 200 miles by road. You will be totally shocked, you will be exhausted, you will need a long rest at least for 2-3 weeks if you go by plane. And Shankara walked all over this place, the whole subcontinent, including today's Pakistan. You have to remember, India was at that time a much bigger unit as a cultural unit. It's included today's Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Samarkand, and of course the whole today India subcontinent. He traveled 4 times all these countries and established 4 important mutts in the 4 corners of this country. Because he started his work pretty early in his life. When he was less than 7 years old, he left his home in search of his guru. By that time, he had already finished his education. So by the time many children just come out of kindergarten, Shankara had already started his search for the ultimate truth and walked 1,200 miles from the extreme south in Kerala, I was born, to Indore, somewhere near Indore, today's Omkareshwar, through forests. So nearly 1,200 miles it will be. and a boy of maybe 6 years, 7 months or something. And about him it is written, Ashtame Chauduro Vedan, Dwadase Sarvashastravid, Shodase Kritavan Bhashyam, Dvatrimse Munirabhyega. This is the verse which was written by a great Sanskrit biographer of Shankaracharya. There are many biographies, but the most prominent of them was Madhaviya Vidyaranya Shankara Digvijaya, a famous Sanskrit classic in which the biographer writes, this boy finished all his education by the time he was 8 years old. And by 12 years old, he had already become proficient in all the existing systems of knowledge. Remember, you have to remember, in those days, Buddhism was very popular in India. Buddhism had not reached Japan or China or Korea in those days. Buddhism was the religion of India when Shankaracharya was born. Remember that. So he had to go through all the vast body of Buddhist literature. Nagarjuna, Dignaga, Vasubandhu, Chandragirti, and so on, Maitrayanath, all the Shunyavada, Vijnanavada, Sautrantika, Vaibhashika systems of Buddhist philosophy, Jaina philosophy, Veda, all this he had to master. All this had already completed by the time he reached 12-year-old. This is an exaggeration. By 16th year, he had completed all his writings. So, Shodashe Kritavan Bhashya means by the time he reached his 16th year, he completed his education, his work, and all his writings. From 16th to his 32nd year, he passed away when he was 32 years old. What did he do? He traveled all over India 4 times. That's why Sister Nivedita, while referring to Shankaracharya's life, not only writings but life, see, this is a greatness that we can only appreciate from a distance, but can never understand. Sister Nivedita was a marvelous writer. She had a way with words. Sister Nivedita was born as Margaret Noble, was a great Vedantin, maybe the greatest disciple of Swami Vivekananda, one would like to say. She was born in Ireland, was a teacher, something of a revolutionary, and he was transformed by Swami Vivekananda's teachings, became a Vedantin, and traveled with Swamiji Vivekananda all the way to India and stayed there and passed away there. A great, outstanding Western woman who lived and died for Vedanta, for universal spiritual humanism. She writes, this is a greatness that we can appreciate from a distance but can never understand. Now, after having completed all his writings, what did he do? He traveled all over India. And why some people sometimes, a question may arise in our minds. How is Shankaracharya's, what is the relevance of his life and teachings to our times? The answer is this. If Vedanta has any relevance, if universal humanism has any relevance, if the idea of universal religious harmony has any relevance, that relevance we get from Shankaracharya's philosophy. Because he was the one who taught us that there is a supreme truth in all religious traditions. If we follow our own path with sincerity, unselfishness, and with a pure mind, we can reach our goal. The whole humanity is one spiritual family, one spiritual fraternity. This idea of universal spiritual humanism is built upon the philosophical, metaphysical, and spiritual foundation of Advaita Vedanta, with this young boy of 7 years old taught this word. That is the relevance. Now, as I said, he traveled all over India 4 times, established 4 important mutts. In fact, the Vedanta Society of Northern California, San Francisco, is part of the Ramakrishna Mission, which is again part of Shankaracharya's monastic tradition. In fact, Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa was given sannyasa by a monk who belong to the tradition of Shankaracharya, because Shankaracharya established, remember, no less than 10 monastic orders. You have to remember, India is not as big as United States, but the population is almost 4 times. And it is the home, is a cradle of so many religions. Buddhism is a world religion, apart from Hinduism, Sikhism, Jainism, and so on. So, what Shankaracharya did, there were so many monks and mendicants all over the country belonging to different religious persuasions and traditions and faith systems. He organized them all into 10 monastic orders. You have to remember, 10 monastic orders like the Benedictine or the Franciscan or Dominican, just imagine 10 of them. In fact, that is what he did in 8th century AD. Now, that was before St. Francis of Assisi, but that was after Augustine's time. That's the point you have to remember. Because Augustine lived in between 354 to 450 AD. So, almost after about 325 years after Augustine's time, Shankaracharya was born. Now, he established these 10 monastic orders. One of them is this Puri tradition. And Sri Ramakrishna's teacher, Totapuri, was a member of that monastic order, one of the 10 monastic orders founded by Shankaracharya. And not only that, today we are worshipping in this temple. Every year you find, in America also there are so many Hindu temples. All kinds of worships you find, worshipping patterns, all traditions of worship. These ritualistic worship was originally formulated by Shankaracharya. It's called, Shanmata Sthapanam and Panchadevata Puja. There were, India was a big laboratory of alarming variety of religious and ritualistic traditions. People used to be pantheists, polytheists, henotheists, animists, totemists, and so on. They used to worship everything. What Shankaracharya did, he organized them all into 5 schools of ritualism. It's called Panchadevata Puja. Worshipping Ganesha, worshipping Shiva, worshipping Vishnu, worshipping Shakti. All these were formulated by him. It's called Panchadevata Puja. And again, he established 6 schools, 6 religious traditions. Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa was worshipper of Mother, Divine Mother. Here, we accept all different deities, Lord Jesus, Buddha, and Krishna, and so on. But the underlying principle is the one central spiritual reality. This idea comes from Shankaracharya. So, he established 6 schools of 6, what is called Sampradaya, 6 cults, sects, 6 groups. All the existing theistic cults were organized into 6 distinct groups. Those who worship Shiva, Vishnu, Divine Mother, Ganapati, Sun, and Subramanya. All this. So just imagine the man who wrote the most marvelous Sanskrit, the most astounding Sanskrit philosophical theses, was the greatest devotional poet. It is said that if Shankaracharya had written only his devotional poetry, he would have ranked as a greater poet than Kalidasa. Kalidasa is supposed to be the Shakespeare of India, or Goethe of India. Like Goethe, Germany, Shakespeare, Kalidasa is for India. If Shankaracharya had not written these bhashyas, if he is supposed to be an incarnation of Lord Shiva, if he had not written all these, if he had not done all this work, if he had just written these devotional poems only, he would have ranked as the poet number one of India, Shakespeare of India. But he was many things else. So he traveled all over India. All kinds of diabolical, ritualistic practices were followed by Hindus at that time. He stopped all that. For your information, the famous temple you heard of Kanchi, it is a human sacrifice was performed in those days, 8th century. Shankaracharya came and stopped it. And in many places, he purified the ritualist traditions. When he appeared, there was nobody to oppose him. He stopped, you should stop all this. So he was a great revolutionary of his times. In fact, all great spiritual revivalists, whether you take Jesus or Buddha, Vivekananda, all these great spiritual teachers were revolutionaries of their times. Today, when we look back from our times, we may feel they are a bit orthodox or conservative. But judged from their times, they were great, outstanding revolutionaries. Now, I was just trying to give a short picture of Shankaracharya's life. And then he had innumerable disciples. He wrote innumerable other works. He was the one who installed perhaps the most important and supposed to be the most ancient pilgrim center of India, not Kashi, but Badrinath. Because Badrinath, in the extreme Himalayas, almost not a long distance from Chinese border, is almost, say, 14,000, 15,000 feet above the sea level. That shrine is located in a place where you cannot build roads. You have to walk muddy ground. He was the one who installed that temple. And he was the one who installed another temple near Kedarnath. All over this place. Now, after all that, he passed away in the year 810, when he was just 32 years old. So whenever we read the Bhagavad Gita or listen to Vedanta, we have to remember it's all work of one youngster who started his work, his business, when he was less than 7 years old and walked 1,200 miles in search of his teacher and passed away when he was 32 years old. Now that's about his life. Now about his philosophy. What did he teach the world? In what way are his teachings relevant? The first central teaching that he gave to the world was, reality is one, truth is one. That's the first teaching. That truth we may call God. If you believe in God, in religion, you may call him God. Or you may call a kind of impersonal, omnipresent, all-pervading principle, which is also immanent, residing in all beings, which is also the ultimate transcendental principle, which cannot be defined, which is beyond words, which can only be experienced in our innermost heart. Now, when you read a primer on Vedanta, and when you read that Advaita teaches a supreme reality, the fundamental stuff, the fundamental principle of the world, as impersonal, as indescribable, indefinable, beyond words, then you may believe, well, in what way is it different from thing itself? You can't. The difference is, Kant said that this reality is unknown, but he also said it is unknowable, because Kant did not accept a nonsensus intuitional immediate cognition. So in a way, Kant was a metaphysical agnostic who believed in the permanent non-cognizability of things in themselves. That's a basic difference. the philosopher who comes closest to Shankaracharya is Kant, Immanuel Kant. Though in the early days, even before Socrates, before Pythagoras, in the ancient Greek philosophical tradition, they believed in some kind of mystical cult, mystical religions. They had an idea that the divine principle is immanent, it is prevalent everywhere. But that idea was not developed during the period of sophists, and certainly Plato did not accept it. Neoplatonists like Philo and Plotinus tried to bring it, but Augustine, in his theological zeal, put an end to the old Neoplatonist philosophical tradition. Now, coming to 18th century, Kant made a bold attempt. On the one hand, he faced the onslaughts of utilitarians, materialist humanists, British humanists, and so on. And he tried to establish one transcendental principle, which he called thing in itself. But he also said that it is beyond the human cognition by mind and the five senses. But he also said that it can never be known. It is unknown, it is unknowable. That's why it's called, he was a kind of metaphysical agnostic. Now, Shankara also says that this reality is beyond sensory perception. Atman or Brahman, the all-pervading, immanent principle, is beyond sensory perception. It is not objectified knowledge. You can see a train passing in front of you, but you cannot see Atman, anything, because Atman is our own true self. Now, it doesn't mean that it is remote. It is not remote, but we cannot see it because it is our own inner self. So it can be realized as our own inner reality. So Shankaracharya was a kind of spiritual, metaphysical monist who said that the ultimate principle, the Atman, the supreme reality, though it cannot be perceived by the five senses and mind, it can be realized within our own inner self. In the old Rigveda Samhita, there is a famous hymn, which sometimes is so well known, that Nasadiya Suktam, the hymn of creation. There is an interesting statement. The ancient sages tried to investigate and tried to understand the original cause of the universe. They did not just sit somewhere and said, well, God created on a particular day this universe. Instead of that, they wanted to understand. They contemplated. Ultimately, they found that this reality cannot be realized, cannot be known externally. But then they turned their inquiry inward. And when they turned their inquiry inward, they realized that supreme reality is their own inner self. When we purify our mind, when we practice unselfish action, when we sincerely practice meditation, we will realize that there is a reality within all of us, which is beyond the psychophysical mechanism, beyond the mind, beyond intellect. And when we realize it, we also realize the same reality is all-pervading. So we can look upon the whole humanity as one spiritual family. That is the ethical dimension of Advaitic philosophy. Sato Bandhum Asadi Niravindan Kriti Pradeshya Kavayo Manisha. You find in Nasadiya Sukta, the 10th mandala of Rigveda. So, just because I had to refer to some of the modern Western thinkers. So, in a way, the basic difference and similarity between Kant and Shankara as a philosopher is this. That Kant was a great philosopher. He was a transcendental, moral, ethical philosopher who realized the importance of science, importance of mathematics, importance of a universal ethical code, because he lived in 18th century. By the time science had already started opening its new era of technological scientific innovations. So his eminence is confined to the realms of philosophy and political thought. That's one point you have to remember. Though he was a great moral philosopher, his eminence is confined to the realms of philosophy and political thought. He was a mathematician, social and political thinker, and he was the founder of German idealistic philosophy. But in Shankara you find not only a philosopher and a mystic, but somebody who could show mankind a new path towards eternal peace, toward eternal happiness. Eternal is very important. When we achieve material things, we may feel happy, but that happiness is short-lived. It is also one part of the coin, one side of the coin. The other coin is unhappiness. Material pleasures can give us happiness, but only momentary. But Shankara says, when we go beyond this sensory world, when we realize that we are the Atman, the supreme reality, which is knowledge absolute, existence absolute, bliss absolute, we reach a state of mind where we feel happy in a very universal manner. That happiness is never lost. And maybe another very important contribution of Shankara to world thought, maybe this may be appreciated by those who are academics. See, that is, in Shankara's tradition you find a kind of synthesis, a harmonious synthesis of philosophy, theology and mysticism, which was never really attempted in Western philosophical tradition, except by some great mystics like Eckhart, but for that they were almost persecuted. Now, mysticism implies some kind of transcendental experience, which goes beyond theological doctrines, which goes beyond books. Now, philosophy is based on reasoning, intellectual reasoning, but philosophy can sometimes degenerate into arrogant free thinking. And mysticism sometimes can lead to superstition, and maybe sometimes it can be misleading as well. And in Shankara's system you find a kind of synthesis of philosophy, which is related to reasoning, theology, which is related to the doctrines enshrined in the ancient scriptures, and mystical experience. That's why it is Srutya, Yuktya, Swanubhutya. You can read the sacred books, but you need not blindly accept whatever is written in any book. So what a bold thinking we have to imagine. Shankara says, and remember, Shankara lived almost 325 years after Augustine's passing away. Augustine had already established the dogmatic Christianity, which in a way stifled independent thought in Western tradition, till the coming of Kant, Hegel and others. Of course, they made a bold attempt. But in 8th century, Shankaracharya says, you can read the Upanishads, but whatever is said in the Upanishads or any of the so-called holy books, you need not blindly accept. You have to use your reasoning. Now, reasoning sometimes can become arrogant reasoning. See, if you say, well, I don't believe in God because I don't see God in front of you, then why should you disbelieve in God? Because you don't see in front of you. You don't disbelieve in everything that you don't see. Many of you may not have seen the North Pole, but you don't disbelieve that such a place exists. Now the question arises, reasoning also can become some kind of fanaticism. as modern science has degenerated into scientism, it is called. Now, Shankara says reasoning is necessary to understand the true essence of revealed scriptures. Every word written in a revealed scripture need not be accepted blindly just because it is written there. We can very easily imagine what havoc, what amount of universal violence are being caused by people who believe that every single word written in a book is sacred. And that alone is true, everything else is false. A simple philosophical dogmatic religion may appear to be very simple, easy to understand, but it leads to religious absolutism and it leads to religious fanaticism. So Shankara says, you read the sacred books, but don't believe blindly. Use your reasoning. That is Shruti. Shruti means revealed scriptures, theology, the canons, the canonical literature. And Yukti means reason. And he doesn't stop there. Reason also is not enough. As I said earlier, you have no business to disbelieve in God just because you don't see Him in front of you. Because you do believe in many things even though you don't see those things. So Shankara says, reasoning also cannot be an absolute criterion for judgment in spiritual life. Revealed scriptures need not necessarily be an absolute criterion for believing in God. Then he says, one's own experience. So, experience, one's own immediate intuitive experience is the ultimate criterion for spirituality. That's why Swami Vivekananda, see, several centuries later, Swami Vivekananda said, he proclaimed, religion begins in our life only with experience. Religion is the manifestation of divinity already in man. This manifestation is nothing but intuitive inner experience. Otherwise, religion is just a word, a dogma. And religion without experience, religion just interpreted as dogma, is sometimes much more dangerous, much more divisive than atheism. That's why Buddha, who did not believe in God, is considered to be one of the greatest humanists of the world. He was an agnostic. He didn't believe in revealed scriptures. Even Buddha did not believe in Vedas, to be very frank. Buddha did not accept Vedas or Upanishads as sacred books. Buddha believed in leading a good human life in this world. So, perhaps you are the greatest humanist the world has ever seen. The one who taught the world the science of non-violence, the philosophy of non-violence. So Shankaracharya says, you may listen to doctrines, you may read the sacred books, but you need not accept blindly. You should use your reasoning through yuktiya. And then that's not enough. It should become part of your own experience. Then only religion becomes spirituality. Otherwise, religion remains religiosity, which is sometimes much worse than atheism. Now, another important point that I would like to stress, because we don't have enough time, but still it is very important. There are some common misunderstandings about Advaita, and this is often caused by reading, when you read translations of books by scholars who have not read the original works of Shankaracharya. Shankaracharya did not deny the world. He did not deny life. Very often, Advaita or non-dualistic philosophy is interpreted as a kind of world negation. Advaita doesn't say the world does not exist. Non-dualistic philosophy does not say the world does not exist. It only says the world does not exist like this for all time. The world is not everlasting. The world is not eternal. It is not absolutely existent, because anything to be called absolutely existent should remain without any change in the past, present, and future. It should remain the same. The world, the universe may not exist for more than 13 billions of years. The universe may undergo changes. So an insect may live for a few minutes or seconds. The universe may live for a few millions of years. Both are within time. They come into existence, which means a transition from a state of non-existence to a state of existence. They exist for some time, they vanish. The universe may vanish after several millions of years. An insect may live only for a few seconds and minutes and may die out immediately. Both are within time and both are relative. So, when he uses the word mithya or maya, he doesn't mean non-existent. He only means relativity, not eternal. And that is very scientific. So you may have heard of this dictum, Brahma Satyam Jagad Mithya Jivo Brahmaiva Napara. Jagad Mithya world is, Mithya means relative. And that's a matter of our own daily experience. Just as individual events, episodes in our own life go on changing, so also the universe also changes. Now, behind this changing universe, there should be a changeless reality. Your change as an idea cannot exist in a vacuum. Change an idea as a logic only against the background of something which is changeless. Then what is that reality behind this changing universe? That changeless, eternal, transcendental, all-pervading, immanent, omnipresent reality is called Brahman, which is not to be characterized in terms of a name, a form, or attributes. Very often, if you define God, this is God's name, and He is explained in great details in one particular book, and this alone is the way to reach Him, and this is the only way to worship Him. It will be very simple, but it becomes highly dogmatic, and we have seen there have been more wars and bloodshed in the name of religion and God than in the name of atheism or agnosticism. So, Shankaracharya says, this absolute reality is transcendental, impersonal, indescribable, but it is not a non-existent, nihilist entity. It is a matter of our own intuitive experience. If we control our senses, if we lead a pure life, if we become unselfish, if we become pure in heart, then this reality can be realized within. That was what Swami Vivekananda said, that religion is a manifestation of divinity already in man. Now, the greatness of this Advaita philosophy, non-dualistic philosophy propounded by Shankara is this, that it not only enables us to look upon the whole humanity as our own brethren, as a single spiritual fraternity, spiritual family, but it also helps you, enables you to look upon other religions with tolerance and acceptance. Swami Vivekananda said not only tolerance, but acceptance. Tolerance implies a kind of, well, all right, you are all wrong, still you can sit somewhere, I give you a place to sit. Now, so Advaita tells you, there cannot be any wrong religion in the world. If we are sincere and honest, whatever path we take will take us to the Supreme. That's it. So even non-believers have got a place in God's empire. As I said earlier many times, if God's existence is dependent upon our recognition that He exists and our worship, if we cannot exist without our worship, then that God should be much more miserable than human beings. So Shankaracharya says, the goal of human existence is to realize this truth within. And once we realize, as I said earlier, there cannot be anything like a wrong religion in the world. Vivekananda, expounding the same non-dualistic philosophy in 19th century, in the last decade of 19th century, said in the Jnana Yoga lectures, he says, we are not traveling from error to truth, but from truth that's lower to truth that's higher. One disciple asked Swamiji for a clarification. So Swamiji said, by lower, he meant incomplete. So as we progress in spiritual life, we get a more and more complete picture of the reality. And then we become more humane, more pure within, and we become more compassionate, more broad-minded towards our fellow human beings. In fact, that is the ethical foundation of Advaita. Vivekananda again, because to understand the true import and relevance and implication of Advaita philosophy in our own times, we have to refer to Swami Vivekananda. He said, the infinite oneness of the soul is the eternal sanction of all morality, all ethics, all good actions, as he said. So Advaita becomes the strongest foundation of universal morality and ethics. If somebody tells you, you should not hurt you should love your neighbor, you should not hurt another person, God will punish you. Suppose somebody will, let God punish me, I don't care. You will be sent to hell. Well, I don't mind if I'm sent to hell. But if you tell him, well, if you hurt another person, you'll be hurting yourself. Immediately, he'll open his eyes. So even a non-believer, even an agnostic or an atheist, can accept the humanism of Advaita philosophy, the humanism of non-dualistic philosophy. That is the uniqueness. So, in an age in which religion is facing a great crisis, there are many agnostics and scientists who will tell you that there is no place for religion, in at least organized religion, in 21st century. We can say the universal spiritual humanism of Advaita philosophy of Shankaracharya, interpreted in modern times in our own language by Swami Vivekananda, has got a great relevance, and its relevance is increasing. Its importance, its significance is increasing as time goes on. Thank you. Namaskar.